The dress had been pressed 3 times. Maisie noticed that detail first. The faint smell of hot iron still clinging to the white linen, the fabric so stiff it creaked when she moved her arms. Someone had been very careful. Someone had wanted everything to look perfect, and that, more than anything else, should have told her something was wrong. She stood at the window of the East Tower, watching the courtyard below fill with servants and banners and the particular kind of controlled chaos that preceded something important. Horses were being brushed. Stone steps were being swept for the 3rd time that morning. The great iron gates of Ashford Keep had been polished until they caught the gray autumn light and threw it back like accusations. The Alpha King was coming. Ronan of the Northern Reach. That was what people called him in careful voices. The kind of voice someone used when they weren't sure who was listening. Alpha King. As though the title itself had weight, had temperature, had teeth. Maisie had heard his name spoken like a prayer, and like a warning in equal measure since she was a girl. And even now, at 23, she couldn't quite decide which one fit him better. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and tried to breathe slowly. Behind her, her stepmother's voice cut through the room like a blade wrapped in silk. "You're going to wrinkle it standing like that." Maisie didn't turn around. "It's already been pressed 3 times, Heloise. A wrinkle won't matter. Everything matters today." A pause. The soft click of heeled boots crossing stone floor. "Come away from the window. You look like a prisoner." "I feel like one." But she didn't say that. She had learned over the years not to say the things that were most true in rooms where Heloise could hear them. She turned from the window and faced her stepmother, a woman who had always been beautiful in the way that certain flowers were beautiful, showy and slightly poisonous, the kind you didn't touch without gloves. Heloise Voss had married Maisie's father 8 years ago, 6 months after her mother's death, and she had been redecorating ever since. Not just the rooms, the entire shape of the household, the alliances, the finances, the future, including, apparently, Maisie's. "He will arrive before midday," Heloise said, adjusting the ribbon at Maisie's collar with fingers that were a little too firm, a little too proprietary. "You will stand in the receiving hall. You will not speak until spoken to. You will not mention your condition." Maisie caught her stepmother's wrist, gently but firmly. "My condition has a name." Eloise's eyes, pale green, always calculating, dropped briefly to Maisie's left hand, where the slight tremor was visible if you knew to look for it. The tremor that had started 8 months ago. The weakness in her legs that came and went without warning. The headaches that arrived like weather systems, sudden and total. The healers called it a slow deterioration of the wolf bond. In plain language, Maisie's inner wolf was fading. Not dead yet, but quiet in the way that dying things went quiet, pulling inward, conserving whatever warmth remained. In a world where wolves meant power and status and survival, a woman whose wolf was weakening was a woman whose value was dropping by the season. "He doesn't need to know," Eloise said smoothly, freeing her wrist with a small smile. "Not yet. After the binding ceremony, it won't matter." After the binding ceremony. Maisie turned back to the window before her face could betray her. She had told herself for weeks that this was simply politics. That the Alpha King needed an alliance with the Eastern Territories. That her family name, her father's name, the name Eloise had married into and was now using like a key, made her useful. She had told herself that useful was enough. That she didn't need to be wanted. That surviving was its own kind of victory. She had also told herself that Callum would come back before it happened. That thought arrived the way it always did, without permission, and with considerable pain. Callum. Not a king. Not an alpha. Not even a particularly powerful wolf. A second son from a border family, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and a laugh that sounded like it surprised even him. He had been at Ashford Keep for 6 months as a diplomatic envoy, and in those 6 months he had done something no one else had managed in years. He had made Maisie feel like a person rather than a piece on a board. He had left 4 months ago. A family emergency, he'd said. He would send word. He had not sent word. She was still waiting. The receiving hall smelled of pine resin and beeswax candles, and the cold breath of the mountain that crept through the high windows no matter how many tapestries were hung to stop it. Maisie stood between her stepmother and her stepmother's personal attendant, a narrow woman named Petra, who had always looked at Maisie with the mild contempt of someone who knew things they were not sharing. The household staff lined the walls. The keep's small council stood to the right. 3 old men who had served her father and now served Heloise's version of her father's legacy. Everything was arranged. Everything was ready. The gates opened. She heard him before she saw him. Or rather, she heard the horses, the particular rhythm of a procession that knew it was being watched and didn't slow down for it. Then, the great doors of the hall were pulled open by the door guards, and cold air poured in, and with it came the first of the king's escort. Wolves in the gray and black colors of the northern reach, moving with the focused, unhurried energy of men who had never once needed to prove themselves, and therefore never felt the urge to. And then Ronan. Maisie had expected grandeur. She had expected the performance of power. A man who filled a room with noise and presence and deliberate impression. What she hadn't expected was stillness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in traveling clothes that were plain enough to be a statement in themselves. Dark wool, no ornament, no ceremonial weight. His hair was black, and his jaw was set, and his eyes, when they moved across the room, moved slowly, as if he were reading something more important than the scenery. They reached Maisie and stopped. Not in the way eyes stopped when they found something pretty. In the way eyes stopped when they found something they hadn't expected. Heloise stepped forward immediately, her voice warming to its most polished register. Alpha King. Ashford Keep is honored by your arrival. Allow me to present. I know who she is. His voice was low and even, and completely without flourish. He said it the way someone stated something obvious, not rudely, but without any particular interest in softening the interruption. His gaze had not left Maisie's face. Maisie met his eyes and felt something strange. Not attraction, not recognition exactly, but the particular alertness of being seen clearly by someone you had not given permission to look. She lifted her chin slightly. He noticed. Something shifted in his expression, almost too small to catch. Then Heloise was speaking again, directing, managing, filling the air with careful words, and Maisie let herself be guided through the formalities of welcome, while something else entirely moved through her mind. He knows who I am. And somehow, in the tone of it, in the weight behind it, she suspected he might know more than just her name. The formal welcome dinner lasted 3 hours. Maisie sat at the long table and ate very little, and listened to a great deal. Heloise controlled the conversation with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years learning to make maneuvering look like hospitality. The old council members contributed carefully worded observations. The king's men were polite and contained. Ronan said almost nothing. He ate with the composed efficiency of someone for whom meals were fuel rather than performance. He answered questions in complete sentences and did not elaborate. He asked twice about the eastern border situation, specific, strategic questions that cut through the diplomatic softening and got to what he actually wanted to know. The council members exchanged small glances when they thought no one was watching. Maisie was watching. She was also watching the king's second, a scarred wolf named Bryn, who sat at his left hand and who had, twice during the meal, leaned close to murmur something that made the king's expression change by approximately nothing. Whatever they were communicating, it wasn't meant for the table. After dinner, she excused herself early, claiming a headache, which was for once completely true. The great staircase seemed longer than usual, and she held the railing and told her legs to cooperate, and they mostly did. She had almost reached the upper corridor when she heard it. Eloise's voice, from the small council room below, the door not quite fully closed. She doesn't know. She's been waiting for that boy to return. I told you she would be a problem if he... And then another voice, male, one of the councilmen. If the king discovers before the ceremony... He won't. Eloise's voice, absolutely certain and absolutely cold. And even if he suspects, the binding will already be done. The Ashford lands pass to her on her 25th birthday. That is 2 years away. If she is bound before then, legal control transfers to the household head. That is me. That is all that matters. A long pause. And the boy? The councilman asked. A shorter pause. Callum Rest is not coming back, Heloise said. I made sure of that. Maisie's hand tightened on the railing until her knuckles went white. The headache cracked open behind her eyes like something breaking. Below, the door creaked slightly, and she pressed herself flat against the wall of the staircase landing, her breath coming in careful, controlled fractions. I made sure of that. 4 words. 4 words that rearranged everything she thought she understood about the last 4 months. Callum hadn't left. He hadn't gone silent by choice. He had been made sure of. And Eloise had arranged an alliance with the Alpha King, not because the family needed protection, not because the Eastern Territories required political consolidation, but because Maisie's 25th birthday was approaching, and with it the inheritance her father had left her, and Eloise needed Maisie bound and legally stripped of control before that day arrived. The Alpha King was not a husband. He was a mechanism. Maisie pressed her back against the cold stone wall and breathed through the shock of it until her legs steadied enough to hold her. Then she did the only thing that made sense. She started planning. She did not sleep. The candle on her bedside table burned down to a stub, and she watched it without seeing it, her mind moving through everything she had heard the way her hands moved through a familiar drawer in the dark. Slow, methodical, searching for the shape of something useful. The stone walls of her room held the cold the way they always did, and the fire in the small hearth had gone to embers hours ago. And Maisie sat at the edge of her bed in her nightgown, with a wool blanket around her shoulders, and thought about Callum. Not with the softness she usually allowed herself, with clarity. She thought about the last morning she had seen him, the courtyard, the gray sky, his horse already saddled, his traveling pack already strapped. He had looked at her with something she had read as reluctance, and now reread as something else entirely, something urgent, something he hadn't been able to say. Had he known? Had he understood what was happening before she did, and been removed before he could warn her? The thought settled into her chest like a stone into still water, slow and final and cold. She got up before dawn, dressed herself without calling her maid, a girl named Sura, who was kind enough and loyal to whoever was paying her wages, which was Heloise, and sat at her writing desk with a blank piece of paper in front of her for a long time. She didn't write anything. Writing left evidence. Instead, she thought about what she knew and what she could use. Her father's will was held by the family solicitor in the town of Creswick, 3 hours south by carriage. She had read it once, at 17, and remembered the key terms. Her inheritance was conditional on her remaining unmarried or married to a match of her own choosing until her 25th birthday. After that, it passed to her unconditionally. If she married before that date, without formal consent from the family legal council, a council her father had appointed, not Heloise's rearranged version of one, the estate remained in household management until her 30th year. Heloise had clearly found a way to interpret that language in her own favor. But there was another clause. Maisie closed her eyes and tried to retrieve the exact wording, the way her father's solicitor had read it in that dry, measured voice. In the event of demonstrated harm to the heir, whether physical, financial, or through deliberate interference with her personal liberty, the estate reverts immediately to independent legal protection under the Ashford family charter. Demonstrated harm. deliberate interference with her personal liberty. What Heloise had done to Callum, whatever she had done, wherever he was, would qualify, if Maisie could prove it. She needed to get to Creswick. She needed to reach the solicitor before the binding ceremony, which Heloise had scheduled for 3 days from now. And she needed to do it without alerting anyone in this household, which meant without her maid, without the household guard who answered to Heloise's steward, and without whatever eyes Heloise had on the guest wing. 3 days. 3 days to find proof, reach Creswick, and find out what had happened to Callum. She was already exhausted, and her left hand had the tremor again, and her wolf was so quiet inside her it might have been a held breath. She would manage anyway. Morning came with the sound of the keep waking around her, boots on stone, kitchen fires starting below, the distant clang of the stable yard. Maisie dressed carefully in something plain and presentable and went down to breakfast as if the previous night had taught her nothing. Heloise was already at the table, composed and perfumed, a letter open beside her tea. She looked up when Maisie entered and offered the particular smile that had always made Maisie feel simultaneously welcomed and assessed. "You look tired." "I slept poorly," Maisie said, which was true. "Nerves are natural." Heloise set down her letter. "The king asked for you this morning. He wants to walk the East Garden before the day's meetings begin. I said you would join him at the second bell." Maisie poured her tea and said nothing. "It would be an opportunity," Heloise added, with the careful tone of someone directing without appearing to direct, "to make a favorable impression. He is not a sentimental man, but he values composure. You have always been composed, Maisie. It is your best quality. Not intelligence, not honesty, not courage. Composure, the ability to hold still and look pleasant while things were done around her." "I'll be there," Maisie said. The East Garden in autumn was a stripped-down, honest kind of place. The roses had been cut back to their canes, brown and thorned against the gray stone walls. The herb beds were mostly bare, smelling of damp earth and the ghost of lavender. A few late-season herbs still held on in the sheltered corners. Rosemary, thyme, the silvery stalks of sage going woody at the base. Ronan was already there when she arrived, standing with his back to her at the far end of the central path, looking at something in the distance, or at nothing in particular. He had his hands clasped behind his back, and he was very still. And for a moment, she watched him the way she'd been watching things since last night, looking for what was true rather than what was presented. He turned before she reached him. He had heard her, obviously. Wolves always heard. "Lady Maisie." "Alpha King." She stopped a few feet away and looked at him in the flat gray morning light, which was less forgiving than candlelight and considerably more honest. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The settled tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had simply stopped noticing the weight. "You don't want to be here," he said. It was so direct and so unexpected that she almost laughed. "I beg your pardon?" "Not in the garden." He looked at her steadily. "Here, this arrangement. You've had the expression of someone counting exits since I arrived." Maisie felt something shift in her chest. The particular discomfort of being seen accurately when you had been working very hard not to be seen at all. She kept her face level. "I wasn't aware my expression was so legible." "It isn't, to most people." He said it without any implication of superiority, simply as a fact. "I'm not most people." She studied him for a moment. His voice was the same as it had been the previous day, even, low, without performance. There was nothing in his posture that asked anything of her. No expectation of warmth, no impatience with her lack of it. She made a decision. Not a full one. Not one she could afford to commit to yet. A partial one. "I received some information last night," she said carefully, "that has made the next few days considerably more complicated than I had previously understood them to be." He was quiet for a moment. A sparrow landed on the wall behind him and left again. "Does this information concern your stepmother?" he asked. Maisie went very still. "Why would you ask that specifically?" "Because I also received some information last night," he said. "From my second. Bryn has a particular talent for finding the things that people in new households would prefer he not find." A pause. "He found records of a financial transaction. 4 months ago. A payment made from your household accounts to a family in the border regions. The Rest family." The name hit her like cold water. The Rest family. "Specifically," Ronan said, "a payment made in exchange for the permanent departure of their second son from the Eastern Territories, with a secondary clause." His jaw tightened slightly, ensuring he would not be in a position to correspond with anyone at Ashford Keep. Maisie heard her own heartbeat for a moment. "Permanent departure," she repeated. "What does that mean?" "He's alive," Ronan said. And the fact that he led with that, the fact that he understood immediately what she needed to know first, was something she filed away without quite knowing what to do with it yet. Confined to his family's estate under a debt arrangement. Your stepmother purchased the family's debts and called them in. Callum Rest can't leave, can't write, can't send word without defaulting on terms that would ruin what remains of his family. The garden was very quiet. Maisie looked at the bare rose bushes and breathed once, deliberately. "She told the council he wasn't coming back," she said. "Last night. I heard her. I didn't know the mechanism. Now you do. Why are you telling me this?" She turned back to him. "You came here for an alliance, for a binding ceremony in 3 days. Telling me this makes that considerably less likely to proceed smoothly." He met her gaze without flinching. "I came here because I was told this was a willing arrangement. I was told the heir of Ashford Keep had agreed to the match and the terms had been settled." Something moved through his expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of contained displeasure directed somewhere other than her. "I don't build alliances on false foundations, and I don't bind myself to arrangements that were constructed by removing someone else." Maisie looked at him for a long moment. "You knew before you arrived," she said slowly. "Bryn found this before you left the north. He found the first thread. The full picture came together last night." He held her gaze. "I came anyway, because I needed to understand what I was walking into. And now that you understand it." He was quiet for a moment. The cold morning air moved through the garden, carrying the smell of damp stone and the last of the rosemary. "Now," he said, "I think we should discuss what you actually need, not what your stepmother arranged. Not what my advisors negotiated with people who had no right to negotiate on your behalf." His voice was level and completely serious. "What you need, to protect yourself, to protect your inheritance. And," he added, after a brief pause, "to help Callum Rest." Maisie had spent 4 months waiting for someone to come back. She had spent last night realizing that waiting was a trap. She looked at the Alpha King. This man she had expected to be a mechanism, and who was turning out to be something considerably harder to categorize, and felt something shift inside her. Not trust. Not yet. Too much had been done in the name of trust already, but the beginning of something. The first careful movement toward it. 3 days, she said quietly. The ceremony is in 3 days. If it proceeds, Heloise gets what she wants, and I have no legal ground to stand on afterward. Then we have 3 days, Ronan said, to make sure it doesn't proceed, not in the form she planned. They met again that evening in the Keep's small library, which was Maisie's territory, in a way that no other room in Ashford Keep had ever been. Her father had built the collection over 30 years, not for show, not for the impression of scholarship, but because he had genuinely loved books the way some men loved horses or hunting, with a quiet devotion that required no audience, The shelves ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, packed with volumes on law, history, natural philosophy, wolf lineage records, and a considerable number of novels that her father had always pretended were her mother's. The room smelled of candle wax and leather binding and old paper, and the particular dusty warmth of a space that had been loved consistently over a long time. Ronan arrived without escort. That itself told her something. He looked at the shelves for a moment before he sat. A brief, genuine survey, not the performative glance of someone pretending interest. Then he settled into the chair across from her writing desk and placed a folded document on the surface between them. "The financial records Bryn found," he said. "A copy. The originals are secured with my second." Maisie unfolded it carefully. The document was dense. Columns of figures, dates, names rendered in a clerk's careful hand. She found the rest entry without difficulty. The sum was considerable, enough to purchase a family's silence and stillness for a very long time. "This is enough to demonstrate deliberate interference," she said without looking up. "There's a clause in my father's will. If harm or interference with my personal liberty can be demonstrated, the estate reverts to independent legal protection." "I know." She looked up at that. He continued without inflection. "I read your father's will before I came. The version filed with the Regional Charter Office. Your stepmother's counsel has been working from an amended interpretation. The original language is considerably more protective of your position than they've been representing." "You read my father's will," she repeated. "I do not enter arrangements without understanding their full legal architecture," he said. "I also do not enter territories without understanding who actually holds power in them and by what mechanism." A pause. "Your stepmother holds influence. She does not hold legal standing. There is a difference, and she has been hoping no one with the authority to clarify that difference would look closely enough to find it." Maisie set down the document. "You've been preparing for this." "I've been prepared for several possible versions of this situation," he said. "The one I hoped not to find was the one I found." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the record of Heloise's transaction, at the neat figures that had purchased 4 months of silence and waiting, and slow, wearing grief. "I need to get to Creswick," she said. "The family solicitor. He holds the original will and the charter documentation. If I can reach him before the ceremony date and file a formal challenge to the Household Council's interpretation, it triggers an automatic legal review. During a legal review, no binding ceremony can proceed. It's in the charter." 3 hours south," Ronan said. "By carriage. Heloise controls the household carriages and the gate guard rotation. She doesn't control mine." He said it simply, as if it were obvious. "My escort traveled with 4 carriages. My men answer to me. The gate guard answers to whoever controls the keep, which is currently a matter of legal dispute, which means it answers to whoever has the most credible authority present." He looked at her steadily. "That is currently me." Maisie felt the strangeness of it again, the way he offered resources without offering them as gifts that required gratitude, without the implication of debt or ownership. He stated them as facts, as tools available to the situation, as if her access to them were simply logical. She was not accustomed to that. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Early, before Heloise is managing the household." "The 4th bell," he agreed. "I'll have a carriage ready." She nodded. Then, because the silence that followed felt like it required something, and she was not sure what, she said, "Why?" He looked at her. "Why does this matter to you?" she said. "You came for an alliance. The alliance your advisors arranged would have given you access to the Eastern Territories without any of this complexity. If Eloise's plan had proceeded and you hadn't looked closely, you would have had a bound wife and a clean political arrangement and none of this trouble." She watched his face. "So why look closely? Why come to me with what Bryn found instead of simply proceeding?" The fire in the small hearth crackled between them. "Because a clean political arrangement built on someone else's suffering isn't clean," he said. "It's just a different kind of corruption." His voice hadn't changed its register, but something in it had settled further, become more deliberate. "I've spent 6 years dismantling the kind of power that operates by controlling what people know and removing the people they trust. I'm not willing to benefit from the same mechanisms I've been working to end." Maisie looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very principled answer," she said, and was surprised to hear something that was almost but not quite dry humor in her own voice. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, perhaps. "I have my moments," he said. She couldn't sleep again, but this time it was different. Less the paralysis of shock, and more the alert, restless energy of someone whose mind was moving in a useful direction. She sat at her window with a blanket and watched the courtyard below where Ronan's escort had set up their camp alongside the keep's stables, and she thought about Callum. She thought about him with more honesty than she had allowed herself in months. She had loved him, she thought. Or the beginning of love, the bright early part before it had the chance to become something tested and real and complicated. He had been warmth and ease and the particular relief of feeling ordinary in a world that had always framed her as a problem to be managed. With him, she had simply been Maisie, not the Ashford heir, not the girl with the fading wolf, not the stepdaughter who was tolerated for political utility. Just a person. Heloise had taken that from her, and Callum was alive. Confined, silenced, but alive. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass and let herself feel the full weight of that, the grief of it, the anger, the relief tangled together in a way that had no clean resolution. Then she straightened. Grief later. Creswick first. The fourth bell found her at the side entrance of the keep with a small bag and her warmest traveling cloak, the dark green one with the deep hood that had been her mother's, and that Heloise had never managed to appropriate because Maisie had never let it leave her room. The morning was black and cold, the kind of cold that had real intention behind it, and the cobblestones were slick with a frost that hadn't been there the night before. Ronan was already at the carriage. He was dressed in plain traveling clothes again, dark and practical, and he had a second mount beside the carriage which told her he intended to ride rather than ride inside. His second, Bryn, a compact, scarred wolf with alert eyes that moved over the courtyard with professional thoroughness, was checking the horse's rigging with the focused attention of someone who expected problems and preferred to find them before they arrived. "You're coming yourself," Maisie said. "Yes." Ronan offered his hand to help her into the carriage, not with ceremony, simply because the step was icy and the offer was practical. She took it. His hand was very warm. She let go as soon as she was inside. "You don't need to," she said through the carriage window as he moved toward his horse. "Bryn and 2 guards would be sufficient." "Probably," he agreed, mounting with the unhurried ease of someone who had spent a great deal of his life on horseback. "I'm coming anyway." She almost pushed the point. Then she decided it wasn't the argument she needed to spend energy on today, and pulled her cloak tighter as the carriage began to move. They were an hour south of Ashford Keep when the carriage slowed without warning, and Bryn's voice came from outside, low and controlled. "Company on the road." Maisie was at the window before the carriage fully stopped. Ahead, where the road curved through a stand of pine trees, 3 riders had positioned themselves across the path. They wore no colors she recognized. Plain, dark traveling clothes, faces partially obscured by scarves against the cold. But the positioning was deliberate. 3 riders across a road at the 5th bell of a gray morning were not travelers. Ronan had already moved his horse forward, placing himself between the carriage and the riders. Bryn was at his left. 2 of the escort flanked the carriage. The lead rider raised a hand, not in greeting. "The Lady of Ashford Keep is requested to return to the keep," the rider said. "By order of the household steward." Heloise's steward. Heloise had known, or guessed, or been told by someone in the keep who had eyes where Maisie hadn't thought to look. "The Lady of Ashford Keep," Ronan said, in a voice that carried without effort, "is traveling under escort of the Northern Reach. The household steward has no authority over my escort or its passengers." A pause, very brief. "Move aside." The riders didn't move. Bryn made a small, almost imperceptible signal to the escort guards. The horses shifted. The weight of the situation rebalanced in the cold morning air. Inside the carriage, Maisie's hand was steady on the door handle. Her wolf was quiet, as it always was now, but something else was moving in her. Not power, not strength exactly, but a kind of crystalline determination, the feeling of a person who has been maneuvered into too many corners and has finally decided that corners are only traps if you stay in them. If Heloise had sent riders to intercept her on a public road, it meant she was afraid. If she was afraid, it meant she knew what Maisie was going to find in Creswick. And if she knew what Maisie was going to find in Creswick, then there was something there worth finding. On the road ahead, the lead rider looked at Ronan for a long moment. Then slowly the 3 horses stepped aside. The carriage moved forward. Maisie let out a slow breath and watched the pines close behind them through the rear window, and thought about what kind of woman she was going to have to be for the next 2 days. A harder one than yesterday, she decided. She could manage that. The town of Creswick was the kind of place that had existed for a long time without feeling the need to announce itself. Its streets were narrow and well-worn, its buildings the color of old bone, its market square quiet on a morning this cold and this early. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin columns, and the smell of baking bread moved through the frost like something almost hopeful. The solicitor's office was on the far side of the square, above a cartographer's shop, up a flight of wooden stairs that announced every footstep. Maisie had been here once, at 17, in a black dress with her father's hand on her shoulder. She remembered the smell: old paper, sealing wax, the particular dry warmth of a room where important things were kept. The solicitor's name was Edmund Hale. He was a small, careful man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, and the manner of someone who had spent 40 years being trusted with things that mattered, and had never once taken that trust lightly. When he opened the door and saw Maisie on his threshold, he went very still. Then he looked past her at Ronan, who had come up the stairs behind her, and his expression moved through several things quickly, before settling into a kind of careful professionalism. "Lady Maisie." He stepped back to let them in. "I had wondered when you would come." "You knew?" she said, stepping into the warm office. "I knew that the household council's interpretation of your father's will was being stretched in directions he would not have sanctioned." He moved to his desk with the efficient certainty of someone who knew exactly where everything was. "I have been waiting for you to come and ask about it for some time. I could not approach you. The terms of my appointment prevent me from initiating contact without formal request from the heir. But I could wait." He had waited 4 months. He had watched and kept the originals safe and waited. Maisie sat down across from his desk and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. "I need to file a formal challenge," she said, "to the household council's interpretation and to the proposed binding ceremony. I have evidence of deliberate interference with my personal liberty." She placed the document Ronan had given her on the desk. "I need it filed under the Ashford family charter, triggering an automatic legal review." Edmund Hale took the document and read it with the focused attention of someone for whom reading carefully was a professional reflex. He turned one page, then another. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something in his posture shifted. A small tightening that told her what she was reading mattered in ways he had not fully anticipated. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "My escort," Maisie said. "The Alpha King's second located it in the household financial records." Edmund Hale looked at Ronan, who was standing near the window with his hands behind his back, not speaking, not inserting himself into a conversation that was between Maisie and her solicitor. "Alpha King. Edmund said, with a careful nod that was not quite a bow, but acknowledged the weight of the title. Mr. Hale, Ronan said, with a nod that was equally precise. Edmund returned to the document. This is sufficient, he said after a moment. The payment to the Rest family, combined with the timeline relative to the proposed ceremony, constitutes deliberate interference under the Charter's original language. He was already moving to the locked cabinet behind his desk. I will file the challenge this morning. The legal review will be automatically triggered upon filing, which renders any binding ceremony legally void until the review is resolved. How long does the review take? Formally, up to 60 days. In practice, with evidence this clear, it could be resolved in 2 weeks. He withdrew a leather-bound portfolio from the cabinet and opened it on the desk. I will also need your formal statement. You'll have it. He began preparing the documents with the focused efficiency of a man who had been waiting to do exactly this. Maisie watched him and felt the shape of the next hour organizing itself. Signatures, statements, the dry procedural language of law that was, when it worked properly, one of the most useful things in the world. They were back on the road to Ashford Keep before midday. The return felt different from the departure, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. The challenge was filed. The ceremony could not legally proceed. Eloise's plan, the plan she had built over months with payments and pressure and careful manipulation, had a crack in it now, a real one. But Heloise would know something had gone wrong. The intercepted riders would have reported back. The absence of Maisie from the keep for an entire morning, traveling with the Alpha King's escort, would have told her enough. She'll move, Maisie said, not really speaking to anyone, watching the road through the carriage window. Yes, Ronan said from across the carriage. He had come inside this time. The morning was colder than it had been on the way out, and practical was practical. She'll try to find a way to invalidate the challenge, dispute the authenticity of the evidence, claim the financial records were misrepresented, attempt to reframe the Rest situation as an unrelated transaction. Can she succeed? Not quickly enough to matter. He looked at her steadily. But she will try to create enough confusion to delay the review. Delay costs you time. Time is what she's always been managing. Maisie was quiet for a moment, watching the pines pass by. She'll also go after the Rest family, she said. If she realizes we know about Callum, she'll move to consolidate whatever hold she has on them. Tighten the terms. Make him less accessible. She looked at her own hands in her lap. The tremor was there, faint but present. He's still trapped. He won't be for long. She looked at Ronan. The Rest family debt, he said. The amount she paid is significant but not beyond resolution. I can purchase those debts. Maisie stared at him. You would do that. I'm already doing it, he said. Bryn sent a rider from Creswick while we were with your solicitor. The offer will reach the Rest family before nightfall. She was silent for a long moment. Outside, the frost had mostly burned off the fields, and the light was trying, weakly, to come through the clouds. A farmhouse appeared and receded. A dog barked somewhere at nothing. You keep doing things, she said finally, without asking whether I want you to. Something shifted in his expression. The debt purchase. I'm not objecting to it, she said. I'm noticing it. She kept her eyes on his. You move quickly. You make decisions and then tell me what you've decided. I'm trying to understand whether that's because you think I can't make them myself, or because you're genuinely trying to help. He held her gaze. The latter, he said. But your correction is fair. A pause. In the future, I'll ask first. She nodded. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. They arrived back at Ashford Keep in the early afternoon to find Eloise waiting. She was standing in the receiving hall with her steward and two of the old council members, and the expression of a woman who had been composing herself for several hours and was very nearly satisfied with the result. She looked at Maisie first, then at Ronan, and the calculation behind her eyes moved like water finding the fastest path downhill. "I hope the morning's excursion was productive," she said, with the particular warmth of someone who hoped nothing of the kind. "Extremely," Maisie said. A silence, the kind that had edges. "The Alpha King and I have some matters to discuss," Heloise said, her eyes moving to Ronan with a smile that was absolutely deliberate in its warmth. "The ceremony arrangements." "The ceremony is suspended," Ronan said. The smile stayed on Heloise's face with the fixed quality of something that had stopped being genuine and hadn't yet received the signal to leave. "I beg your pardon?" "A formal legal challenge has been filed with the Ashford family solicitor under the terms of the family charter," Ronan said. His voice was even and clear and entirely without drama. "The challenge triggers an automatic review, during which no binding ceremony may proceed. This is a matter of law, not preference. The review will determine the status of the Household Council's authority and the validity of certain financial arrangements made in the last 4 months." Eloise's smile had gone. In its place was something colder and more honest. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "I hope it is," Ronan said. "The review will clarify." She looked at Maisie then, and the look was entirely different, stripped of warmth and management, a look between two people who both understood exactly what was happening. Maisie met it without flinching. "You have no idea what you're doing," Heloise said quietly, just to her. "I have a fairly good idea," Maisie said. That evening, Petra came to Maisie's room. Not Heloise's errand this time. That much was clear from the way the woman moved, closed the door quietly behind her, and stood with her back against it, her narrow face tight with something that was not quite guilt, but was in the neighborhood of it. "She's sending someone to the Rest estate tonight," Petra said. "Not to tighten the terms, to remove him entirely, somewhere he can't be found and can't be used as evidence in any review." Maisie felt the cold of it go through her cleanly. "How do you know this?" "Because she told the steward while I was in the room and she forgot I was there." A pause. "She forgets I'm there often. It has occasionally been useful." Petra looked at her with the complicated expression of someone who had spent years serving the wrong person and had finally reached their limit. "I am telling you because your father was a decent man, and because I would like to not have been complicit in everything I have apparently been complicit in." Maisie was already moving toward the door. She found Ronan in the corridor outside his rooms, which meant Bryn had already told him, which meant Bryn had people watching things Maisie hadn't even thought to watch, and she felt a complicated surge of relief and gratitude that she pushed aside for later. "The Rest estate," she said. "Ryder already sent," Ronan said. "Bryn intercepted the information 20 minutes ago. Our Ryder is faster than hers." He paused. "Callum Rest will be moved to a location under my escort's protection before midnight." Maisie stopped in the corridor and pressed her hand flat against the wall and breathed. The stone was cold under her palm. The tremor in her hand was visible. She didn't care. "He's going to be all right," she said. Not a question. A thing she was deciding to believe. "He's going to be all right," Ronan said. She looked at him, this man she had expected to be a mechanism and who had turned out to be something she didn't quite have a word for yet. Someone who moved with purpose and kept his word and asked for nothing in return that she hadn't offered. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. No performance. No claim on the gratitude. She went back to her room and sat at her desk, and for the first time in 4 months allowed herself to cry, not from grief, not from loss, but from the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding themselves together through sheer force of will, and has finally reached a moment where holding together is not the only option. She cried until she didn't need to anymore. Then she washed her face and picked up a pen and began writing down everything she remembered about the last 8 months. Every conversation with Heloise, every decision that had seemed strange at the time and now made terrible sense. Evidence, all of it, carefully recorded. She worked until the candle burned low. The legal review took 11 days. Maisie had expected it to feel long. Instead, it felt like the first 11 days in months in which something was actually moving in the right direction, and that changed the texture of time considerably. Edmund Hale arrived at Ashford Keep on the 3rd day with 2 regional charter officers and a disposition for methodical thoroughness that Heloise's counsel had clearly not anticipated. They worked through the household financial records with the patient. Unhurried focus of men who had no particular allegiance to anyone in the building and every allegiance to the documents in front of them. Heloise remained at the Keep. She had no legal grounds to leave. The review required her presence as household manager. And so she moved through the corridors with the contained energy of someone who had not yet decided whether to fight or negotiate, and who was running out of time to choose. Maisie avoided her when she could. When she couldn't, she was polite and said very little. She spent most of her days in the library, which had become, in a quiet and unremarked way, a shared space. Ronan worked there too. Correspondence, territorial dispatches, the constant administrative weight of governing a large territory that did not pause because its king was managing someone else's crisis. He worked at the far end of the long table, and she worked at her desk, and they did not talk constantly, which she found unexpectedly to be one of the most comfortable things about his company. He did not require her to perform ease. He was simply present, and presence, she was learning, was its own kind of language. On the 5th day, he looked up from his correspondence and said without preamble, "How long has your wolf been quiet?" She didn't startle. She had half expected the question. Wolves noticed wolves, and he would have sensed it the way you sensed an empty room even before you saw it was empty. 8 months, she said. What did the healers say? That it's a deterioration of the wolf bond. That stress, grief, sustained fear, any of those things can cause a wolf to pull inward. She paused. They also said it's reversible, in most cases, if the underlying cause is removed. He was quiet for a moment. And the underlying cause was living in a house where someone was slowly dismantling my life while smiling at me across the dinner table, she said. The flatness of her own voice surprised her slightly. Yes, I think so. He nodded and returned to his correspondence. But that evening, when she came back to her room, there was a small jar on her bedside table. Dark glass, sealed with wax, with a strip of linen tied around it. She opened it carefully. It smelled of pine and something sharper, medicinal, with a thread of something sweeter underneath that she couldn't quite name. There was no note. She didn't need one. She used it that night, and the headache that had been sitting behind her eyes for 4 days eased enough that she slept properly for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember. Callum arrived on the 7th day. He was thinner than she remembered, and quieter, and there was something careful in the way he moved that hadn't been there before. The particular carefulness of someone who had learned that environments could change without warning. He arrived under escort of 2 of Ronan's men, and Maisie met him in the courtyard, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. I tried to send word, he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered. They took the letters. Every one of them. I know, she said. I know that now. He looked at her face and then, briefly, at Ronan, who was standing at a distance that was respectful and deliberate. I heard what happened, what she was planning. Most of it has been stopped. Most of it. He caught the word. The review is still in progress, but it's going well. She paused. Are you all right? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I will be. He looked at her with the honest eyes she had always valued in him. Are you? She thought about the answer. The real one, not the managed one. I think I'm becoming someone who will be, she said. That's different from where I was 2 weeks ago. He nodded slowly. He looked again at Ronan. He helped, Callum said. It wasn't quite a question. He helped, Maisie confirmed. Something moved through Callum's expression, complex and honest, and without any particular performance attached to it. He was not a man who pretended things were simpler than they were. That had always been one of the truest things about him. Good, he said quietly, and he meant it. On the 11th day, Edmund Hale called everyone to the receiving hall. The charter officers stood along the wall with their documents. The old council members, 2 of them, the third having quietly requested reassignment 3 days into the review, which told its own story, sat in their chairs with the expressions of men who had already calculated which way the wind was going. Heloise stood to the left of the fireplace in a dress the color of slate, composed in the way that stone was composed, without softness, without yield. Maisie stood to the right, with Ronan at a distance behind her that was not possessive, but was entirely present. Edmund Hale read the findings in his dry, precise voice, and the words fell into the room like stones into water, each one sending out its own rings. The household council's interpretation of the Ashford will had been made in bad faith. The financial transaction with the Rest family constituted deliberate interference with the heir's personal liberty as defined under the charter. The amended council, 3 members appointed by Heloise without charter authorization after her husband's death, had no legal standing. Their decisions, including the proposed binding arrangement, were retrospectively void. The Ashford estate reverted to independent legal protection effective immediately. A trustee appointed by the regional charter office would manage administrative functions until Maisie's 25th birthday, at which point full control would transfer to her unconditionally. Heloise Voss, as household manager operating outside her legal authority, was required to vacate the primary residence within 30 days, and was barred from any further financial management of the estate. The room was very quiet when Edmund finished. Heloise looked at Maisie across the space between them. Her composure was still there, technically, but it had the quality of something that was being maintained through considerable effort and would not last much longer. For a moment, Maisie looked back at her and felt the full weight of 8 years. The careful management, the slow erosion, the smiling and the planning and the payments made in the dark. She felt anger. She felt grief for her father, who had trusted badly and paid for it. She felt the strange lightness of a thing finally being named for what it was. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. She had expected to. Instead, she felt something quieter, the particular stillness of a person who no longer needs to fight because the fight is over. You should go and begin your preparations, Maisie said to Eloise. 30 days is not as long as it seems. Eloise held her gaze for one more moment. Then she turned and walked out of the receiving hall, her heels precise on the stone floor, and did not look back. Petra stayed. She had offered her resignation that morning and Maisie had declined it, because the woman had come to her room with information when it mattered, and that was not nothing. Sura, her maid, stayed also. The old council members were replaced. Edmund Hale helped with the appointments, quiet and methodical, people her father would have chosen. Callum stayed for 2 weeks, and then, carefully, began making his own plans. His family's debts were cleared. Ronan had handled it cleanly and without ceremony, and when Callum tried to speak to him about it directly, Ronan had simply said the matter was resolved and moved on, which was, Callum told Maisie afterward, the most disarming response he could have given. He was going home. He needed to rebuild something there, take care of his family, figure out who he was on the other side of the last 4 months. He and Maisie said their farewell in the East Garden, among the bare rose bushes, in the same cold morning light where so much had already been decided. "You're going to be extraordinary," he told her. And the way he said it was not romantic and not grief-stricken. It was simply true, offered without complication, the way he had always offered things. "Go home, Callum," she said. "Take care of yourself." He left on a gray morning with a small escort and a horse that was better than the one he'd arrived on, because Ronan had seen to that too without being asked. Ronan stayed 3 more days after that. He had a territory to return to, a council waiting, responsibilities that had been patient with his absence for longer than they typically would be. On the last evening, he came to the library one final time, and they sat by the fire with the comfortable quiet that had become, over 11 days, something she no longer found strange. "Your wolf," he said, at some point in the evening. "Is it warmer?" She considered the question honestly. "A little," she said. "Something is changing. Slowly." He nodded. She looked at him in the firelight. This man who had arrived as a mechanism and left as something considerably harder to categorize, and who had never once asked her to be grateful, or soft, or anything other than what she actually was. "The alliance," she said. "The one your advisors were negotiating. The political arrangement." She paused. "I assume that's no longer relevant in its original form." "The original form was built on a false premise," he said, "so no. But the Eastern Territories and the Northern Reach still have interests that align." He looked at her with the steadiness that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he was thinking about seriously. "They do." "Then there are other arrangements," she said carefully. "Legal, political, mutual, that don't require a ceremony. That could be built properly, over time, on a foundation that's actually real." She held his gaze. "If that's something you'd consider." Something shifted in his expression. The ghost of a smile again, slightly more present than usual. "I would consider it," he said. "Good." She looked back at the fire. "Then we'll begin there." He left the next morning. His escort assembled in the courtyard with their gray and black colors, and the carriages were loaded, and the horses were ready, and Ashford Keep stood solid and cold in the early light, looking more like itself than it had in years. Maisie stood at the top of the front steps. Ronan paused at the bottom of them, already in traveling clothes, already oriented toward the road. He looked up at her. "Edmund Hale will have the draft charter amendment ready within the month," he said. "I'll review it carefully," she said. "I know you will." A pause. His eyes held hers for a moment with the particular quality of someone who was saying something that had no clean verbal form. Then he inclined his head, once, precisely, and turned toward his horse. Bryn, passing at the foot of the stairs, caught her eye briefly and gave a nod that was small and dry and somehow communicated everything. That his king was a difficult man to know, and a reliable one to have on your side, and that in Bryn's considered professional opinion, this was not the last time she would see either of them. She watched the procession move through the gate. She watched until the last horse passed through, and the gate closed, and the sound of hooves on the road faded into the general silence of the morning. Then she turned and went inside. Spring came to Ashford Keep the way it always had, incrementally, without announcement, the frost retreating from the garden beds a little more each morning, until one day the bare rose bushes had small green shoots at their tips, and the herb garden was coming back in full, and the air smelled of damp earth and something living underneath it. On a morning in late March, Maisie was in the east garden with her hands in the soil, replanting the lavender border that had gone woody and needed refreshing, when she felt it, a warmth in her chest, quiet and steady, like a fire that had been burning low for a long time and had finally been given enough air. Her wolf, not loud, not dramatic, but present in a way it hadn't been in almost a year. A warm, alert, breathing presence, waking slowly the way living things woke, without rush, without performance. She sat back on her heels and pressed her earth-covered hand flat against her sternum and felt it. "There you are," she thought. The wolf didn't answer in words. It didn't need to. It was simply there, warming the space it had always been meant to occupy, coming back to her in the way that things came back when the conditions that had driven them away were finally, truly, gone. She stayed in the garden for a long time after that, working steadily, her hands in the soil, the spring light moving across the stone walls. The charter amendment arrived in April. It was thorough and fair, and written in language that her father would have approved of, careful, precise, balanced in the way that good agreements were balanced, protecting both parties rather than leveraging one against the other. She read it twice, made 2 small changes, and sent it back with her seal. The response came in May, with a second document, a formal proposal for a political council between the Eastern Territories and the Northern Reach, to meet twice yearly, to manage shared interests and address disputes through established process. It was signed by Ronan in his precise, minimal hand. At the bottom, below the official signature, in the same hand but smaller, less formal, were 4 words that were not part of any political arrangement. "The roses will be in bloom." She read it 3 times. Then she smiled, small and private, and entirely her own, and set the document on her desk. She wrote back the same day. He arrived in June, when the roses were in bloom. Not with a full escort this time. A smaller party, 6 men, practical and quiet. Not an arrival designed to impress. Just a man coming to a place he had been before, in the right season, at the time he had indicated. Maisie met him in the East Garden, because that was where she had been, and because it was the truest room the keep had, and because she was no longer in the business of performing welcome for people she had already welcomed. He looked at the roses, and then at her. She looked at him and felt the warmth in her chest, the quiet, steady presence of her wolf, and the particular clarity of someone who has been through something very difficult and come out the other side knowing exactly who they are. "The Charter Council meets in August," she said. "It does," he said. "There's a great deal to discuss." "There is." She looked at him in the June light, which was honest and warm and entirely without agenda. "I'm glad you came back," she said. "Not as a political statement, not as a performance, simply as the truth, offered plainly, the way truth should be offered when you have finally stopped being afraid of it." He held her gaze with the steadiness that had always been simply how he was. "I said I would consider it," he said. "I considered it." She almost laughed. Not quite, but close. They walked the garden together in the morning light, the roses in full bloom against the old stone walls, the lavender border newly planted and already taking hold, the herb beds full and fragrant with the smell of rosemary and thyme and the clean green scent of things growing in good soil. They talked about the Charter and the Council and the Eastern Territories and the practical realities of 2 regions learning to trust each other, and they talked about smaller things too,